You'll never be real family. My mother-in-law said those words only 6 months after I married her son. Not during an argument, not during a family crisis, not even when she was angry. She said them casually, like she was stating a fact, like she was telling me the weather, and somehow that made them hurt even more. I remember the exact moment, the exact room, the exact expression on her face. 12 years have passed since then, yet I can still hear her voice, still feel the silence that followed, still remember how everyone at the dinner table pretended not to hear it. My name is Emily Carter, and for 12 years I tried everything to belong. Everything. I attended every family gathering, every birthday, every anniversary, every reunion, every celebration. I brought gifts, cooked meals, helped with hospital visits, organized events, babysat children, supported relatives. I showed up every single time, and somehow, it was never enough. Because in Patricia Reynolds' eyes, I had one permanent flaw. I wasn't born into the family. I married into it. To her, that distinction mattered a lot. The Reynolds family was successful, respected, comfortable. Patricia reminded everyone of that constantly. Family history, family traditions, family reputation. Those were her favorite topics. What she never mentioned was kindness, or loyalty, or character, because those things didn't seem nearly as important to her, at least not when compared to bloodlines. And unfortunately for me, I wasn't part of the bloodline, at least according to her. For years, I convinced myself things would improve, that eventually she would accept me, that eventually she'd see how much I loved her son, how much I cared about the family, how much effort I made. But every year brought another reminder, another comment, another insult disguised as a joke, another reason to remember my place. And according to Patricia, my place was always somewhere below everyone else. The only reason I stayed was Michael, my husband, Patricia's son. He wasn't like her, not even close. He was patient, thoughtful, kind, everything she wasn't. He saw how his mother treated me. He hated it, but he also believed she would eventually change. We both did. Looking back now, that was our biggest mistake. Because some people don't change. They simply become more comfortable showing you who they really are. And Patricia became very comfortable, especially after Grandma Eleanor's health started declining, because that's when money entered the picture, and when money enters family relationships, people reveal themselves very quickly. Grandma Eleanor was 86 years old, sharp-minded, independent, and far more observant than anyone realized. She owned several properties, significant investments, family land, and enough assets to make certain relatives suddenly very interested in spending time with her. Patricia was one of those relatives. Before Grandma's wealth became common knowledge, Patricia rarely visited, rarely called, rarely checked in. Then suddenly, everything changed. Weekly visits, daily phone calls, constant attention. It was so obvious even Michael noticed. But Grandma never said anything. She simply watched, listened, observed, the same way she'd done her entire life. And what nobody realized was that she was keeping track of everything. Every conversation, every act of kindness, every act of selfishness, every person who showed up only when money became involved, including Patricia, especially Patricia. One Sunday afternoon, about 8 months before everything changed, the entire family gathered at Grandma's house. It seemed like an ordinary visit. Lunch, conversation, family photos, nothing unusual, at least at first. Then Grandma asked me for help in the kitchen. I followed her, happy to assist, as usual. Once we were alone, she smiled, a warm smile, the kind that always made me feel welcome. Then she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Emily, are you happy?" I laughed softly. "Of course." She raised an eyebrow, the way only grandmothers can, the kind of look that says, "Don't lie to me." I looked away, suddenly unable to answer. Grandma nodded slowly, like she'd already known the truth. And for the first time, I wondered how much she had actually seen, how much she had noticed, how much she understood. Because maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as invisible as Patricia wanted me to believe. And maybe Grandma was paying much closer attention than anyone realized. What I didn't know then was that Grandma had already started making decisions. Important decisions. Permanent decisions. Decisions that would eventually leave Patricia speechless. and changed the entire family's future forever. Over the years, I learned something important about Patricia Reynolds. She didn't create rules to keep the family together. She created rules to control it. And somehow those rules always seemed to apply to everyone except her. If family dinners started at 6, she'd arrive whenever she wanted. If everyone was expected to contribute, she'd decide her presence was contribution enough. If someone else made a mistake, it became family gossip. If Patricia made a mistake, it became a misunderstanding. The entire family had spent years adjusting around her, making excuses for her, protecting her, accommodating her, and because they'd done it for so long, nobody even noticed anymore. Nobody except Grandma Eleanor. And maybe me. At first, I genuinely tried to win Patricia over. I really did. When Michael and I bought our first house, I invited her over before anyone else. She criticized the kitchen. When I hosted Thanksgiving for the first time, I spent 3 days preparing everything. She complained about the turkey. When Michael received a promotion at work, I organized a surprise celebration. She spent the evening explaining why his cousin's career was more impressive. No matter what I did, the finish line kept moving. The approval I hoped to earn never came, and eventually I stopped trying to earn it, but that didn't stop the disappointment, because part of me still wanted a real family, the kind where people supported each other, the kind where people celebrated each other's successes, the kind where love wasn't treated like a competition. One evening, about 3 years after our wedding, the family gathered for Michael's birthday. Most of the relatives were there. Patricia sat at the center of the table. As usual, everyone talked, laughed, shared stories. The atmosphere felt relaxed, until someone asked a simple question. When are Michael and Emily planning to have children? The room became quiet. Not awkward, just curious. A normal family question. Before I could answer, Patricia spoke first. Let's hope they wait. I blinked. The room laughed nervously. Patricia smiled. The family has high standards. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Michael immediately set down his fork. Mom. His tone carried a warning. Patricia pretended not to notice. I'm joking. Her favorite defense. Always joking. Always innocent. Always misunderstood. At least according to her. The conversation moved on. But I noticed something. Grandma Eleanor had been watching. Not speaking. Watching. The same way she always did. Quietly collecting information. Like pieces of a puzzle. As the years passed, Patricia became more confident, more direct, less careful, especially whenever family inheritance came up. Nobody openly discussed Grandma's estate, at least not around Grandma. But when she wasn't present, that was a different story. The assumptions had already been made. Patricia assumed she would inherit most of it. Her brother assumed he'd receive a large share. Their children had expectations, too. Everyone seemed to have already divided Grandma's assets in their minds. The properties, the savings, the investments, the family land, the lake house. It all had imaginary owners already. And somehow none of those imaginary owners included me. Not that I expected anything. I didn't. The money wasn't mine. The decisions weren't mine. The inheritance wasn't mine. But the conversations revealed something important. Many family members viewed Grandma less as a person and more as a future transaction. And that bothered me. A lot. Grandma noticed it too. One afternoon, I stopped by her house to help organize some paperwork. She sat at the kitchen table sorting documents, the same table where she'd spent decades feeding family members, the same table where she'd listened to countless stories, the same table where she'd quietly observed everyone. I helped stack folders, organize records, label envelopes, normal things. Then Grandma suddenly laughed. I looked up. What? She shook her head. Nothing. That answer usually meant something. What is it? Her smile widened. I've learned something interesting. I waited. Grandma tapped the stack of papers. Money makes people tell the truth. I frowned. What do you mean? She leaned back. The funny thing about inheritance isn't who receives it. She paused. It's who starts acting differently before it arrives. That sentence stayed with me. Because it was true. Painfully true. And deep down, I knew exactly who she was talking about. Around that same time, Patricia started hosting more family gatherings. At first glance, it looked generous, thoughtful, family-oriented. But the longer it continued, the more obvious the real purpose became. Every gathering seemed designed to strengthen her position, to remind everyone she was the center of the family, the organizer, the leader, the future decision-maker. And each event included small moments that chipped away at me. Tiny exclusions, tiny reminders, tiny insults. Never enough to create a major confrontation, always enough to hurt. At one gathering, everyone received personalized gifts, except me. At another, family photos were organized, and somehow I ended up standing at the edge of every picture. At another event, Patricia introduced everyone by family connection, then introduced me simply as Michael's wife. Nothing more. No name, no warmth, no affection. Just a title. Like a temporary guest. Like someone passing through. Not someone who had been there for over a decade. The strange thing was that Grandma always noticed. Always. One evening after a family barbecue, she quietly sat beside me. The sun was setting. Most relatives had already left. The yard was peaceful. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, "Does it still bother you?" I knew exactly what she meant. I smiled sadly. "Sometimes." Grandma nodded, like she'd expected that answer. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Being accepted by the wrong people isn't worth much." I looked at her. She continued, "Focus on the people who already love you." The words hit harder than she probably realized, because I'd spent years chasing approval from someone determined not to give it. Years. Trying to prove my worth. Trying to earn my place. Trying to become enough. For someone who had already decided I never would be. Meanwhile, Patricia's confidence continued growing, especially after rumors started circulating that Grandma was updating her estate documents. The family became obsessed. Phone calls increased, visits increased, interest increased. Everyone suddenly wanted to know details. Everyone suddenly wanted information. Everyone suddenly became very concerned about Grandma's well-being. Funny how that happens. The closer people think they are to money, the more caring they appear. Grandma noticed every second of it, every fake smile, every strategic visit, every performance. And unlike everyone else, she wasn't fooled. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. I arrived at Grandma's house to drop off groceries. A normal visit, or so I thought. When I entered the kitchen, I immediately noticed someone sitting across from her. A lawyer. Several thick folders sat on the table. Legal documents, estate documents, wills, trust records. The lawyer smiled politely. Grandma smiled too, then looked directly at me. And for a brief moment, I saw something unusual in her expression. Certainty. Like she'd finally made a decision. A permanent one. A decision nobody else knew about. A decision that would eventually leave Patricia speechless and completely change the future of the Reynolds family. But before that day arrived, Patricia was going to make one final mistake. One that Grandma would never forget. And one that would ultimately cost her far more than money. Looking back now, there wasn't one single moment that made Grandma change her will. It wasn't one argument, it wasn't one insult, it wasn't one bad decision. It was years of watching, years of listening, years of noticing things other people ignored. But if I had to point to the moment that finally pushed her over the edge, it happened at Patricia's 60th birthday party. And ironically, Patricia planned the entire event herself. For months, she'd talked about it. Not a normal birthday, not a simple gathering, not a family dinner, a celebration, a milestone. Something elegant, something memorable, something worthy of Patricia Reynolds. At least according to Patricia Reynolds. Every family conversation somehow returned to the party, the venue, the decorations, the guest list, the catering, the music. Everything had to be perfect, and naturally, everyone was expected to help, including me, especially me. For nearly 3 weeks, I spent my evenings helping organize things, designing invitations, calling vendors, confirming reservations, managing schedules, solving problems, the same way I always did. Not because anyone asked me, because that's who I was. I helped. That's what family does. At least that's what I believed, even when the effort wasn't appreciated, even when nobody noticed, even when Patricia acted like everything somehow happened on its own. I still helped. Michael often joked that I was the unofficial event planner for the Reynolds family. The funny thing was, it wasn't really a joke. The party was held at a large country club just outside town. Beautiful property, large ballroom, expensive decorations. Everything looked impressive. Patricia loved impressive. She loved things people could see, things people could admire, things people could talk about. Recognition mattered to her. A lot. In some ways, she was the complete opposite of Grandma. Where Grandma avoided attention, Patricia chased it. Where Grandma valued character, Patricia valued appearances. And that difference was about to become very important. The afternoon started well enough. Guests arrived, music played, people mingled, photographers moved through the room, family members laughed and shared stories. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But beneath the surface, the same old patterns were still there. And unfortunately, those patterns always seemed to find me. About an hour into the event, family photos began. A professional photographer gathered everyone together. Rows were organized, groups were arranged, people shifted positions. The usual chaos that comes with large family pictures. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Patricia started directing people herself. And that's when things changed. "Michael, stand over here," she pointed. "Jessica, next to me." More instructions followed. Children moved, grandchildren moved, siblings moved. Everyone found a place. Then Patricia looked at me, briefly, only briefly, and said, "Emily, why don't you stand near the edge?" The edge. Again. Always the edge. Always slightly outside the circle. Never fully inside it. I felt the familiar sting, the one I'd experienced hundreds of times. Not enough to create a scene, just enough to remind me. Michael immediately frowned. "Mom," Patricia interrupted, "it's just for the picture." Another excuse, another explanation, another way to make exclusion seem reasonable. The photographer looked uncomfortable. Several relatives looked uncomfortable too, but nobody said anything. Nobody except Grandma. Grandma was seated nearby, watching, as always. She looked toward Patricia, then toward me, then calmly said, "Emily belongs with the family." The room instantly became quiet. Not because Grandma raised her voice, because she rarely did. When Grandma spoke, people listened. Patricia forced a smile. "Of course she does." Then she turned back toward the photographer. But she never changed the arrangement. And somehow that made it worse. Because now everyone understood. Everyone knew what had happened. And everyone knew Patricia had chosen not to fix it. The photos continued. The smiles continued. The celebration continued. But something had shifted. At least for Grandma. I could see it. She wasn't angry. Grandma rarely showed anger. She was disappointed. Deeply disappointed. And somehow that expression carried far more weight. Later that evening came the speeches. Several family members spoke. Funny stories, childhood memories, kind words, the usual things. Then Patricia stood up. And once again, she couldn't resist making herself the center of attention. For nearly 15 minutes, she talked about family legacy, family traditions, family history, family pride. The words sounded nice. The guests applauded. But those of us who knew her understood something. Patricia loved talking about family, as long as she got to decide who counted. Then she said something that changed everything. At least for Grandma. At least permanently. She looked around the room, smiled, then said, "Blood is what keeps a family strong." Several guests nodded. The comment seemed harmless. At first. Then she continued. "People come and go." A few people laughed. I didn't. Neither did Michael. Because we knew exactly where this was heading. Patricia raised her glass. "But blood remains." And then she looked directly at me. Only for a second. A single second. But it was enough. More than enough. The implication couldn't have been clearer. I wasn't blood. I wasn't permanent. I wasn't truly family, just like she'd been suggesting for 12 years. The room grew uncomfortable. Again, the same way it always did. People knew. They always knew. They simply chose silence. I felt embarrassed, not because I believed her, because I was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of being polite. Tired of absorbing insults disguised as tradition. For a moment, I considered leaving. Actually leaving. Walking out. Driving home. Ending the evening. Then I noticed Grandma. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Patricia. And the expression on her face told me everything. She'd heard enough. More than enough. For the rest of the evening, Grandma barely spoke. She remained polite, friendly, respectful, but quieter than usual. Observing, thinking, watching, the same way she'd done her entire life. Only this time felt different. More final, more certain. Like she had reached a conclusion. A permanent one. 3 days later, Grandma invited me over for tea. Just the two of us. Nothing unusual. At least that's what I thought. When I arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table. Several folders sat beside her. The same lawyer from before was there, and this time the documents were open, signed, organized, complete. Grandma smiled when she saw me, then reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. There was warmth in her eyes, affection, certainty, and something else. Relief. Like she'd finally finished something important. Like a difficult decision had finally been made. What I didn't know then was that Patricia's speech at the birthday party had been the final piece, the final confirmation, the final proof Grandma needed, and because of that speech, an inheritance everyone thought was guaranteed was about to change forever. But Patricia still had no idea. In fact, she was already making plans for money she no longer controlled. And when the truth finally came out, the shock would be unlike anything the family had ever seen. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to finally be accepted by Patricia, to hear her say she was proud of me, to hear her call me family without hesitation, to stop feeling like I was constantly being tested. But sitting across from Grandma Eleanor that afternoon, I realized something important. I had spent 12 years chasing approval from the wrong person, and that realization was strangely freeing. The kitchen smelled like fresh tea and cinnamon bread, the same way it always had. Sunlight poured through the windows. Everything felt peaceful. Yet there was something different about the atmosphere, something heavier, more serious. The lawyer sitting at the far end of the table certainly contributed to that feeling. His briefcase rested beside him. Several folders sat neatly organized. Everything looked official, permanent, important. Grandma smiled as she poured tea into 2 cups. The lawyer quietly excused himself to take a phone call outside. For the first time, we were alone. Just the two of us. Grandma handed me a cup, then sat down. For several moments, neither of us spoke. She simply looked at me, the same way she always did. Patiently, thoughtfully, like she was seeing things other people missed. Finally, she broke the silence. How long? I frowned. How long what? She sighed softly. How long have you been pretending it doesn't hurt? The question caught me completely off guard. My throat tightened instantly, because deep down I knew exactly what she meant. The comments, the exclusion, the constant reminders, the feeling of never quite belonging. I looked down at my tea, unable to answer immediately. Grandma waited. She never rushed people, never pressured them. Eventually, I whispered, "A long time." She nodded, not surprised, not shocked, almost like she'd expected that answer years ago, because she probably had. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Her voice carried genuine curiosity, not criticism, just curiosity. I thought about the question, really thought about it. Then I laughed softly, a sad laugh. Because I didn't want Michael stuck in the middle. Grandma nodded. I continued. And because I kept hoping things would change. The words felt strange coming out loud, because once spoken, they sounded naive, hopeful. almost foolish. But they were true. For 12 years, I'd convinced myself that one more holiday, one more birthday, one more family gathering might finally be different. That maybe Patricia would soften, maybe she'd see me differently, maybe she'd stop treating me like an outsider. Yet every year brought another disappointment, another reminder, another excuse. Grandma stared out the window for a moment, then quietly said, "Some people only understand family when they need something." The sentence lingered in the air. I immediately knew who she meant. Patricia. And not just Patricia. Several other relatives, too. People who suddenly became attentive whenever inheritance was mentioned. People who visited more often when financial discussions appeared. People who remembered Grandma's birthday only after hearing rumors about her estate. The truth was uncomfortable, but it was still the truth. Grandma took another sip of tea, then surprised me. "You know what the saddest part is?" I shook my head. She smiled sadly. "Patricia wasn't always like this." That caught my attention immediately, because as long as I'd known Patricia, she'd been exactly the same. Critical, judgmental, status-focused, controlling. I couldn't imagine another version of her. But Grandma could, because she'd watched Patricia her entire life. "When she was young," Grandma said, "she cared about people." I listened carefully. Not perfectly. Nobody is perfect. But she cared. Grandma looked down at her hands, then continued. "Somewhere along the way, she became obsessed with appearances." The sentence hit hard, because it perfectly described Patricia. Appearances, status, reputation, image, those things mattered more to her than almost anything else. Grandma sighed. And when people care too much about appearances, they eventually stop seeing people. The room fell silent, because there wasn't anything to add. She was right, completely right. After a few minutes, the lawyer returned. Grandma immediately changed the subject, at least partially. The conversation shifted toward paperwork, documents, estate planning, legal details, things I didn't fully understand. I assumed she simply wanted another witness, another trusted person present during the process. Nothing more. Then Grandma surprised me again. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Emily." I looked up. Her eyes were warm, steady, certain. "You've been family since the day you chose to be." The words hit me harder than any insult Patricia had ever delivered, because for 12 years I had been hearing one message. You don't belong. You aren't really one of us. You'll never be family. And now, the one person whose opinion truly mattered was telling me the opposite. I couldn't speak, couldn't stop the tears forming in my eyes. Grandma squeezed my hand, then smiled. "You don't need anyone's permission to belong." That conversation stayed with me for weeks. Long after I left her house, long after the paperwork disappeared, long after life returned to normal, or at least what passed for normal in the Reynolds family. Because while Grandma quietly finalized her decisions, Patricia became increasingly confident. Dangerously confident. Rumors about the estate continued spreading. Nobody knew specifics, but everyone assumed the same thing. Patricia would inherit the largest share. After all, she was Grandma's daughter. The oldest child, the family organizer, the one who constantly talked about family legacy. In Patricia's mind, the outcome was already decided. She acted like someone who had already won. And that confidence began changing her behavior. At family gatherings, she openly discussed future renovations for property she didn't own. She talked about investment plans involving money she hadn't inherited. She even referred to one of Grandma's rental properties as my building. The first time I heard her say it, I thought she'd misspoken. The second time, I realized she hadn't. The third time, I understood something important. Patricia genuinely believed the estate already belonged to her, and nobody corrected her. Not publicly. Not yet. One afternoon, several relatives gathered for lunch. The conversation drifted toward real estate. Patricia immediately took control, as usual. "I'll probably sell the north property." Several relatives nodded. Patricia continued. "The taxes aren't worth dealing with." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "Sell the north property?" She didn't own the North property. Grandma did. Yet Patricia spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if ownership were merely a technicality. I glanced toward Grandma. She remained completely silent, eating her lunch, listening, observing, the same way she always did. Only now, I noticed something different. The look in her eyes, a quiet certainty, the expression of someone holding information nobody else possessed. And for the first time, I wondered if Patricia had made a terrible mistake. Not a small mistake, a life-changing one. Because while Patricia spent months acting like the future belonged to her, Grandma had already decided who truly understood the meaning of family. And the gap between those two realities was growing larger every day. Sooner or later, they would collide, and when they did, the entire Reynolds family would discover a truth that had been sitting quietly in front of them all along. A truth Grandma had seen for years, a truth Patricia had ignored, a truth powerful enough to change every expectation in the room. The will was finished, the decisions were made, the documents were signed, and somewhere ahead, a day was coming when those papers would finally be opened, when assumptions would meet reality, when words spoken over 12 years would come back to haunt the people who said them, and when Patricia Reynolds would learn that being related by blood is not always the same thing as being family. The call came on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was at work when my phone rang. The screen showed Michael's name. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't crying, he wasn't panicking, but his voice sounded different, quieter, heavier, and somehow that made it worse. Emily. A long pause followed. Then he said the words I had been dreading for months. Grandma passed away this morning. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. I sat motionless in my office chair, unable to respond, unable to think, unable to process what I'd just heard. Even though we all knew her health had been declining, even though we'd known this day was coming. Nothing prepares you. Nothing. Because no matter how old someone is, no matter how much warning you receive, losing a person like Grandma Eleanor leaves an empty space that can never truly be filled. The funeral took place 4 days later. Hundreds attended, former students, neighbors, friends, business owners, church members, families she'd helped over the years. The turnout surprised many relatives, but not me. Grandma had spent 86 years investing in people. Not money, people. And those investments had paid dividends in love and respect. The church overflowed with visitors. Stories were shared, memories were exchanged, tears were shed. And throughout it all, one thing became very clear. Grandma had touched far more lives than anyone realized, including her own family. Patricia cried more than anyone, or at least appeared to. She sat in the front row, accepted hugs, accepted sympathy, accepted condolences, and if I hadn't known her for 12 years, I probably would have believed every bit of it. But something felt off. Not because she wasn't grieving. I'm sure she was, in her own way. But beneath the grief, there was anticipation. A quiet anticipation she couldn't completely hide. The kind people get when they're waiting for something, expecting something, looking ahead to something. And unfortunately, I knew exactly what it was. The will. I hated myself for thinking it. But I wasn't wrong, because the funeral hadn't even ended before certain relatives began discussing inheritance. Quiet conversations, whispered assumptions, private calculations, people estimating values, properties, accounts, investments, the family land, the lake house, the rental units, the savings. Everyone seemed to have a number in their head. Everyone seemed to have expectations. Everyone except me. And honestly, that made me feel strangely alone, because while others focused on assets, I was still focused on loss. The week after the funeral felt strange. The family gathered frequently, more than usual. Some relatives visited Grandma's house repeatedly. Others suddenly became interested in documents, paperwork, property records, financial information. People who rarely called now called daily. People who rarely visited now visited constantly. And the timing wasn't subtle. Not at all. Even Michael noticed. One evening, as we drove home from yet another family gathering, he sighed. They're already fighting over things. I looked out the window. The sun was setting. The roads were nearly empty. What things? He laughed bitterly. Things nobody even owns yet. That answer told me everything. 3 weeks later, the lawyer scheduled the official reading of the will. Immediately, the family became obsessed. Phones rang constantly, messages flooded group chats, speculation spread everywhere. People acted as if a major sporting event were approaching. Predictions, theories, expectations. Everyone wanted answers. And almost every prediction looked exactly the same. Patricia would inherit the largest portion. Her brother would receive a sizable share. The grandchildren would receive smaller portions, and the remaining assets would be divided accordingly. Simple, predictable, expected, at least according to everyone else. The morning of the reading arrived, a gray, cloudy afternoon, the kind of weather that somehow matched the mood. The meeting was held inside a private conference room at the lawyer's office. Large wooden table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows. Quiet, professional, serious. Family members arrived early, much earlier than necessary. Patricia arrived first, naturally, dressed perfectly, confident, composed, like someone preparing for a victory speech. She greeted people warmly, smiled constantly, accepted sympathy. But underneath it all, there was excitement, the kind she couldn't quite hide. Michael and I arrived together. The room was already half full. Relatives sat in small groups, talking quietly, speculating, predicting. The atmosphere felt strange, part mourning, part business meeting, part competition, and honestly, I hated it, because Grandma deserved better, much better. As people settled into their seats, I noticed something interesting. Patricia had chosen the chair closest to the head of the table, a small detail, but symbolic, very symbolic, almost like she'd already claimed her position, already claimed authority, already claimed ownership. The irony would become obvious later, very obvious, but not yet. At exactly 2 o'clock, the lawyer entered. The room immediately fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward him. He carried a thick folder, the one everyone had been waiting for. Months, years. Some people had probably been waiting decades. The lawyer sat down calmly, opened the folder, adjusted his glasses, then looked around the room. I appreciate everyone being here. Nobody responded. Nobody wanted introductions. Nobody wanted small talk. Everyone wanted answers, and the lawyer knew it. He began with formalities, legal language, procedures, administrative details, the usual things. Most relatives listened impatiently, waiting, watching, checking their phones, glancing at each other, especially Patricia, who seemed increasingly eager. Like a student waiting for exam results she already believed she'd passed. Then the reading finally began. The lawyer reviewed several smaller gifts first: donations, charitable contributions, community organizations, scholarship funds, church programs, local causes. Several family members looked surprised, others looked annoyed, because Grandma had left a significant amount to charity, far more than anyone expected. I smiled. It felt exactly like her, helping people one final time, even after she was gone. Patricia, however, didn't smile, not once. Her attention remained fixed on one thing: the remainder of the estate, the major assets, the properties, the investments, the inheritance she believed was waiting, the inheritance she believed belonged to her. Then the lawyer turned a page, paused, and said something that changed the atmosphere instantly. Before discussing asset distribution, Mrs. Reynolds left a personal statement she requested be read aloud. The room became silent, completely silent, because this wasn't standard, at least not according to several relatives. Even Patricia looked surprised. The lawyer unfolded a separate document, a handwritten letter, Grandma's letter. And suddenly I remembered the conversation we'd had months earlier, the tea, the lawyer, the folders, the certainty in her eyes. A strange feeling settled in my stomach, because for the first time, I realized Grandma had been planning this for a very long time, and whatever came next was going to surprise everyone, especially Patricia. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, looked down at the letter, and began reading. My family. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even glanced at their phones, because Grandma's voice seemed to fill the room through her words. Warm, wise, steady, familiar. And within the first few sentences, people began realizing something. This wasn't merely a farewell. This was a message, a lesson, a final truth. And before the afternoon ended, that truth would completely change the Reynolds family forever. The conference room was completely silent. The lawyer adjusted the pages in front of him. Then he continued reading Grandma Eleanor's letter. My family. Even those two words felt powerful, because everyone in the room knew Grandma had never wasted words. When she spoke, there was always meaning behind it. Purpose, wisdom, truth. And somehow, even after she was gone, that hadn't changed. The lawyer continued, If you're hearing this letter, then I am gone. That is unfortunate for me, but hopefully not for all of you, because perhaps now you'll listen to something I've been trying to teach for years. The room remained still. No whispers, no movement, just attention. Complete attention. Family is not measured by blood alone. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably, especially Patricia, though she tried not to show it. The lawyer kept reading. If blood alone created family, then kindness, loyalty, sacrifice, and love would mean nothing. I have lived long enough to know they mean everything. I felt my throat tighten, because I already knew where this was heading. And judging by Patricia's expression, so did she. The lawyer turned the page. Throughout my life, I have watched people carefully. A few nervous glances spread across the room. People often reveal their true character when they believe nobody is paying attention. Now several relatives looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, because Grandma had always seemed quiet, passive, observant. Many people assumed she missed things. They couldn't have been more wrong. She noticed everything, every insult, every kindness, every selfish act, every sacrifice, every lie, every truth. And now, everyone realized it. Far too late. Some family members visited because they loved me. The room listened carefully. Others visited because they loved what they believed I could give them. That sentence hit like a thunderclap. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But everyone understood, especially Patricia. The lawyer continued. There is a difference between people who show up for a person and people who show up for an inheritance. A long silence followed. Even the lawyer paused briefly, allowing the words to settle, allowing the truth to do its work. Patricia stared straight ahead, completely expressionless. But I noticed something. Her confidence was gone. The certainty she'd carried into the room had disappeared. Then came the sentence that changed everything. One person entered this family through marriage and spent 12 years proving what family truly means. My heart stopped. Completely. The room slowly turned toward me, one face after another. I felt frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to believe what I was hearing. The lawyer continued. Emily never demanded recognition. Tears immediately filled my eyes. She helped when nobody asked. I looked down, trying to compose myself, trying not to cry. The lawyer kept reading. She visited when there was nothing to gain. Now I couldn't stop the tears. She cared for people because she cared about people. Several relatives looked ashamed, because they knew it was true. They'd seen it, for years, and many had remained silent. Then Grandma delivered her final observation, the one that left the room speechless. The people who called her an outsider never realized she understood family better than they did. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even looked at Patricia, because nobody needed to. The message was clear, painfully clear, and everyone knew exactly who Grandma was talking about. The lawyer folded the letter carefully. then looked around the room. I will now proceed with the estate distribution. The atmosphere immediately changed. The emotional moment gave way to nervous anticipation, because now came the question everyone had been waiting for. Who inherited what? The lawyer opened another folder, a thicker folder, the official documents, the final decisions, the permanent decisions, the ones that could no longer be changed. Several smaller gifts came first: family heirlooms, jewelry, personal items, photographs, keepsakes, important, meaningful, but not what people were really waiting for. Everyone knew that. The major assets still hadn't been mentioned: the properties, the investments, the land, the money. And judging by Patricia's posture, she was becoming impatient. Then the lawyer turned another page. The lake property. Everyone immediately focused. Patricia, especially. The lake house alone was worth a substantial amount. She practically leaned forward. The lawyer continued. Will be sold, and the proceeds donated to the Eleanor Reynolds Scholarship Foundation. Gasps spread through the room. Patricia blinked. Several relatives looked stunned. Others exchanged confused glances. Nobody had expected that. Nobody. The lawyer continued. The rental properties will remain under trust management and fund educational programs specified by Mrs. Reynolds. More surprise, more confusion, more shock. The family was beginning to realize something. The estate wasn't being distributed the way anyone expected, not even close. Then came the moment everyone would remember, the moment Patricia's entire expression changed. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, then spoke clearly. The primary family residence and associated assets shall transfer to... He paused. Briefly. The room held its breath. Emily Carter. Silence. Complete silence. Nobody reacted. Nobody seemed capable of reacting. The words simply hung there. Unbelievable. Impossible. Shocking. Patricia's face lost all color. Instantly. Completely. She looked as though she'd misheard. Like everyone else. The lawyer repeated it. Emily Carter. No mistake. No misunderstanding. No confusion. The inheritance had been left to me. The room erupted. Questions, whispers, shock, confusion. People looked at each other, then at me, then back at the lawyer. I sat frozen, unable to process what was happening, unable to comprehend what I'd just heard. Me? Why me? Then the lawyer answered the question before anyone asked. He opened one final letter, a personal note from Grandma, specifically addressed to me. His voice softened as he read, Emily. The room became quiet again. You spent years believing you needed permission to belong. Tears rolled down my face. You never did. I covered my mouth, trying unsuccessfully to hold back emotion. The lawyer continued. Family is built through actions, not blood. Several relatives lowered their eyes. You earned your place long ago. The tears came harder. I simply wanted the paperwork to catch up. The room fell silent. Again. The kind of silence people experience when truth leaves no room for argument. Then came the final sentence. The one nobody would ever forget. The greatest inheritance I can leave behind is not property. It is the reminder that character matters more than entitlement. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because there was nothing left to say. Grandma had already said it perfectly. Patricia sat motionless, for perhaps the first time in her life. No arguments, no speeches, no explanations, no excuses, just silence. Because how do you argue with the truth? How do you argue with 12 years of evidence? How do you argue with the judgment of the woman who knew everyone better than they knew themselves? You don't. You can't. As the meeting ended, relatives slowly began leaving. Some apologized, Others offered congratulations. Several hugged me. A few cried. But the moment I'll remember forever happened just before I walked out. Patricia approached me, slowly, carefully, for the first time in 12 years. She looked unsure of herself. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, like she couldn't find the right words, maybe because there weren't any. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't realize." She stopped. Emotion filled her eyes. And for the first time, I believed she meant it. Not because she lost money, because she finally understood what she'd lost long before that: respect, trust, connection, family. I smiled gently, not because I'd won, because Grandma had. Her lesson had survived. Her truth had survived. Her values had survived. And ultimately, that mattered more than any inheritance ever could. Because my mother-in-law spent 12 years telling me I wasn't real family. Then Grandma changed her will.